So you're probably going to have to do some, some additional posts, find links, click on those, essentially post that, get the data back. And then you may even need to do things like, trigger some searches or filters or even do delays. So I may want to, let's say, well, let me just do like a Best Buy. It's like we've seen that before. So I could go out to Best Buy. And I think this is actually one example we used in the past. So let's say I want to look for like PS5 consoles. So what I'm doing here is what I would need the application to do. So it would say, okay, trigger the search, and then it's going to have to walk through all of the result items that it wants, and then I'm going to have to scrape those, grab the data, and kick it out into my database or data store. So that's scraping. It can be, like I said, it can be time consuming. It can be very fragile, because if they change their site layout and format, then it basically is going to break the scraping piece, because you're assuming that things follow a certain structure, and it's not a published structure. So it's sort of like an undocumented feature, is that you can go in and scrape a site. But as soon as they change something, you're going to have to update your scrapers. Another one that is not used as often, but falls more into a category like an API, is using RSS feeds. In this case, you're going to get really good structured data, much like an API. The RSS feeds tend to give you less parameters, but at least will give you data, some sort of feed of data for a time frame, or maybe out to a certain, limited number of results. It's really easy to call. So you could take, for example, if I go out to the Developerpreneur site, and I think if I just do RSS, wait, I don't want to do it here because it's not going to display right. Let me go do it in, if I go do it in, which I don't have up, let me jump over here real quick and do, I think I have Google Chrome. Yes. So if I go here and I do Developerpreneur, if I can spell it right. Then I'm going to get back something like this. So it's going to be XML, which makes it nice. And then you're going to be able to see that it's got some formats here. So like for this RSS feed, I can see what the channel is. I can see if there's an image involved. I can always store that. I can go into the item itself, and I can see stuff like my title. I can see a link to it, who's the creator, what's the publishing date. I've got category fields. I've got a, whatever, this is basically oh, here we go, my description, comments. I mean, all of this is XML formatted, so I can take that. And although, like you saw, I had no parameters. So this is just bringing data back however long it brings it back. In this case, since it's WordPress, it's set how many articles back you can get. But these are nice and formatted, and it's XML. And so we've got a lot of ways to parse our way through XML and pull that information out and suck it into our database. So again, very similar to an API. APIs may return XML format as well. Although, sometimes it may be easier to use JSON. They will, because a lot of times you can get that kind of format. But in general, RSS feeds are far easier to deal with than scraping itself, actual web page scraping, and therefore can be a very powerful tool to use for your scraping efforts. So let's talk about some tips, tricks, and basically trip ups that you may run into, sort of like some helpful hints if you're going to get into a scraping project. First thing to do is start simple and validate your calls, whether this is an API call, whether it is scraping a site with an API call, or even an RSS feed. With an API call, maybe put as tight a parameter for the query as possible. If you can narrow it down to an API call that is by a single ID, so that it's a single record, that's what you want to start with. Make sure in the simplest case, in a web scraping, it would be like a single page. I want to go to that page and I want to just be able to pull that data, or maybe pull that data and then navigate to the detailed page and pull the data from there. Going through that process of figuring out exactly what you want to get, verifying that you can get it, building out the mappings and storing that data and making sure that it maintains its integrity essentially is always going to be that first step. And it's going to be so much easier to do that when you do it with a small result set than trying to spin through huge numbers of records. One, because it takes a while to go through those records, so your cycle time is going to be pretty big. But also because it's easy to get lost in dealing with a whole bunch of different things and special cases, where it's better to pick one, get that working, and then expand it out to future records. And then in that case, if you see stuff where there are special cases or some places where fields are missing or things like that, then you can address that accordingly on a case-by-case basis to allow it to support a wider range of results. You're going to want to look for hidden fields. And by that, those are going to be things that maybe don't, particularly on a website, fields that are a type of hidden, things that are not necessarily obvious. In an API, they may be some things that are maybe even undocumented. Maybe you see the result sets that the documentation has, but when you actually pull the API results, you see there are additional fields. A lot of times these are going to be things like internal IDs and things of that nature that are going to be needed in order for you to, maybe to properly link to another web page, or to make a subsequent call that gets you more detail about the data that you're pulling. Since we usually go with multiple data sources, it is very helpful to use a pattern where you have intermediary type classes or structures to store stuff in, and then those things do the save and update to your data store, whatever that happens to be. So then what you end up doing is, your first time through, you have to build the whole thing. You build the parsers, or the scraper, the parser, and then you build the data structure, and then you have to build the insert, update, delete, probably the CRUD related functions, so that those data stores the data in those data stores can be pushed into your database, or in those data structures can be pushed in. But then the bonus is, the next time around, if you do that right, then all you have to do is build the parser mapper into your general structure, and then everything behind that works, because you know that all your inserts, updates, deletes all work as long as the data is valid. And so you just need to do, and the next time through, you just need to do your parsing. And then, since you've already done even probably a lot of the validations within those classes, then you parse or scrape, put that data into class, and then run your validation steps. And then, voila, whether you have a valid set of data that you've pulled. And with that, you're probably going to want to do either in those classes, or it's sort of like a utility functions. You're going to find that formatting type helpers are very, very valuable. Do not assume, particularly across multiple data sources, that stuff's always going to have the same format. Phone numbers, dates, phone numbers and dates in particular are probably the most common things you'll run into. One site may be a phone number is just 10 straight numbers. Another one, maybe it always has hyphens built into there. Some of them may be formatted with like little parentheses and such. So you're going to want to have something that takes data, that kind of data, those individual data items, and does some sort of a conversion to a standard format that you're going to store. Like I said, dates are huge for that. There's a lot of times that dates will be all over the map as far as what, style and format they use, and a lot of them, because they're going to be localized, and it may not be an actual date time field where you can just do your conversion real easy, particularly web scraping stuff. There's all kinds of different ways you may see it displayed. So what you're going to want to do is have some way to, like a helper, have these things that take a string in and then can do some formatting and then spit it out in a consistent format that's the one that you're going to use for your data storage. Another thing is, like I said, date and time is going to vary quite a bit as far as their format, and money as well, currency, because currency is different from maybe even country to country. You're going to have different types of currencies, and of course you're going to have different symbols around that and things of that nature. You may even have different scale of numbers. You may have something that where 1 million of something is never heard of, and then you may have another where everyday transactions are 1 million of that currency. But with those, that's again where you're going to want to have those formatting helpers are going to be huge, because there's going to be so many different ways you can see it that you're going to want to be able to sort of cut through the formatting things that may be on a display and get to the actual data items that you need so that you can convert those into your system. Now, dates and times in particular are can be a challenge when you are pulling from different data sources, if dates and times need to match up with data from other data sources, because then you may run into situations where you need to know what time zone it's in. And you probably are going to have to convert to, for dates, times, and currencies, you're probably going to want to convert to sort of a universal time zone or universal monetary unit, and then be able to convert back out if you need to. So, like for money, it may be that you hit sites that use euros and ruples and yen and a whole bunch of different stuff, but you decide what I'm going to do is convert that to a dollar amount, store that as US dollars in my database, and then when I kick stuff back out, people convert, or my site that my features that provide those monetary values will convert it to whatever monetary system the user wants. There's a lot of work that can go into those, but once you have them, they can be pretty valuable. And actually, the nice thing with a lot of those formatting helpers is that they are, and even some of those structures, they're going to actually be sort of portable from project to project. A lot of the validators, particularly because phone addresses, things like zip codes and that can be very different. Those are going to show up in app after app. So once you've got those built in, that's nice code to be able to carry with you to your next project. Sizing and outliers. This is like probably the biggest challenge of scraping a lot of the times, but also just figuring out how to take multi-data sources and combine them into something that's sort of a single data source, which is your store. Because you may have values that are typically a certain length. Like think of a name. If you have a last name, probably, I don't know, maybe 20 characters is typically going to be the limit, maybe 30. But then you may have somebody that's got some really convoluted, hyphenated, it's like their last name is like Jones -Brown -Smith McGillicuddy, and it's just this big long thing. And so you need to figure out, how do we handle that? Do we need to have some incredibly huge long data size to be able to store what we think is anything, or do we have to have some way to be able to either like encode that so it gets in, it gets cut down to a smaller value, or maybe truncated or something along those lines. And then you have to look at outliers as well. You're going to find situations where 999 times out of 1,000, the data looks like this, but every so often it looks a little different. And that may be due to special characters, which we'll see a little bit as well. One of those things to look at, but it may be things like, particularly like web scraping, that maybe the data is almost always on one line, except for sometimes when it goes to a second line. Those kinds of outliers are things that you're going to have to sort of keep an eye out for when you're scraping. You got to look at what happens if there's a null or an empty value, because sometimes data just doesn't get entered, and it can be inconsistent. So you may have an address that's typically address line city state zip, and you'll have data in there that's got address line city, no state but a zip, or maybe city state but no zip, or maybe no city but a state and a zip, or maybe no address line and just a zip. You got to be aware that there's going to be essentially gaps in the data. And then how do you handle that? How do you want to handle that in those cases? Because sometimes that's critical. Sometimes that data is very important for you to be able to really to utilize it. For example, like let's go back to that job data. Let's say that part of what you do is you're giving a list of healthcare related jobs by city. If you pull data that doesn't tell you what city the job's in, then that's going to be, it's almost useless to you because you don't know what city to put it in. But in the same situation, what happens if they list it in 4 different cities? You want to make sure that maybe that gets replicated to 4 records, 1 for each city. But then what happens if somebody searches 2 or 3 different cities? Do you want to deal with seeing that same job show up twice or more often?